During the course of the Second World War, SS Chief Heinrich Himmler made visits to the various frontiers of the Holocaust, most notably of such being the extermination camps. When one thinks of the Nazi extermination camps, they tend to think of Auschwitz, which Himmler made the point of visiting twice, once in March 1941 and again in July 1942. These visits, which are covered in depth in part 1 of this miniseries, are very well documented, thanks largely in part to the autobiography of SS-Oberscharführer Rudolf Höss, the former commandant of Auschwitz. This is in contrast to Himmler's visits to the other, lesser-known extermination camps. Himmler's exact whereabouts during the latter half of the war, that being from roughly 1942 until 1945, are not concretely established on a day-to-day basis. However, sources and testimonies strongly converge on the notion that Himmler visited both Sobibor and Treblinka in the February of 1943, as part of his inspection of the Operation Reinhard death camps, starting in Lublin. It is also highly likely that Himmler visited Sobibor in the July of 1942, which will be discussed shortly, and possibly even visited Belzec, according to the testimony of Rudolf Reda. On the other hand, we know that Himmler never visited Marie Trostenetz, as the camp was instead visited by Reinhard Heydrich in the April of 1942. Furthermore, we can also comfortably assume that Himmler didn't make visits to either the Semlin or Chelmno extermination camps. This is in spite of an Italian Wikipedia article I came across the other day, where someone had incorrectly inferred that Himmler's visit to Chelm, as noted in his diary on February the 12th, 1943, must have meant that the Reichsführer visited the Chelmno death camp. Now, perhaps this person had assumed, rather foolishly, that Himmler couldn't spell, and had forgotten to put the N-O at the end of the word. Or, alternatively, perhaps they had never heard of the Polish city of Chelm, to which Himmler was actually referring. Himmler marked Chelm down in his diary for two reasons. Firstly, it was accurate, as he would have been driven to Chelm on his way to visit Sobibor on February the 12th, 1943, where he was picked up by a special train, which is also affirmed in the survivor testimonies that we will get to shortly. Secondly, Himmler referred to visiting Chelm and then to the SS Sonderkommando, as it would be far more ambiguous to anyone reading his diary, if it were to ever fall into the wrong hands. SS Sonderkommando actually refers to Sobibor, which would be well known by Himmler and the other Reinhard SS, but not necessarily by someone out of the loop, which was exactly the point of such cryptic messaging. It's the same reason for why the SS never directly named Belzec, Sobibor or Treblinka as annihilation or extermination camps in documentation, preferring to refer to them as transit camps or just to their names alone, which has misled thousands of people to argue that these camps really were transit camps. Of course, what these people can never explain is why Belzec, Sobibor and Treblinka had hundreds of thousands of people sent to such tiny transit camps in the middle of nowhere, with seemingly no record of where they went afterwards. They are also, of course, banking on the notion that the SS would be explicit in all of their transmissions and letters concerning large movements of people, even though they were in the middle of fighting a war. But I digress from my original point, which is to never blindly trust Wikipedia, or any source for that matter. It's best to read and check as many primary sources and secondary readings as possible. Hence, during my research for Himmler's visits to the Sobibor extermination camp, it seemed highly likely that the Reichsführer SS made his first visit to Sobibor on July the 19th, 1942. This visit originates with Himmler's completion of his second tour of Auschwitz on July the 18th, 1942, after which he was immediately driven to Lublin to meet with SS Gruppenführer Odilo Globoknik to discuss the early stages of Operation Reinhard. Himmler's visit to Lublin was precisely 4 days before Gross Action Warsaw, the operation that saw hundreds of thousands of Jews deported from the Warsaw ghetto to the newly opened Treblinka extermination camp. To put it simply, July 1942 was one of the most important months in the scope of the final solution, as it saw a major acceleration of Operation Reinhard, as well as Himmler's visits to both Auschwitz and Sobibor. Following his arrival in Lublin on July 18, 1942, Himmler held a meeting with SS-Gruppenführer Adolf Globoknik to discuss the progress of, and future of, Operation Reinhard. During this visit to Lublin, Himmler informed Globoknik that the Majdanek concentration camp would now be included within the scope of the exterminatory aspect of Operation Reinhard, leading to the eventual establishment of Majdanek's respective gas chambers and crematoria. Once he had finished his discussion with Globoknik, Himmler turned in for the night, in anticipation of a very busy day on July the 19th. Before Himmler visited Sobibor on July the 19th, 1942, he first visited the Travniki concentration camp that same morning, which at the time was primarily utilised as a forced labour camp for able-bodied Jews. However, Travniki was best known for its training programme, which saw the conversion of primarily former Soviet POWs into the so-called Travniki men, who were, as Peter Black so aptly put, the foot soldiers of Operation Reinhard. At Travniki, the primarily Ukrainian former Red Army soldiers would be given basic ideological and military training, as well as practicing handling live prisoners, given Travniki's purpose of forced labour. Following their graduation from Travniki, these men would usually then be posted to one of the Action Reinhard death camps, that being either Belzec, Sobibor, or Treblinka. Following his tour of Travniki, Himmler was then driven to Chelm, where he awaited a special transport, which would take him and his subordinates to Sobibor. Moshe Szklarek recalls Himmler's July 1942 visit as follows. It was the month of July 1942. I remember this incident well. I remember that 2 hours before the arrival of the train, my friend Joseph Pines and I were called to polish the officers' boots. The officers' quarters were near the platform. At approximately 11 or 11:30, 2 hours after I had been called, I saw a luxury train coming into Sobibor. The victims who had arrived in those days were brought in freight carts, with all kinds of belongings hanging outside of the carts. This one was a set-up train with a passenger carriage. A group of senior officers alighted from it, headed by Himmler, who stood out with his spectacles and long trench coat. During his visit, SS-Oberscharführer Franz Stangl showed Himmler the camp, which was still relatively fledgling at this point, in the July of 1942. On the day of Himmler's visit, no transport arrived at the camp, so it is unlikely that Himmler witnessed a gassing in Lager 3, or the extermination area. In all likelihood, Himmler's visit to Sobibor on July 19, 1942, was a brief one, as a means for the Reichsführer SS to witness the foundations of an Action Reinhard facility. The ramifications of his visit, however, were apparent in the weeks and months following Himmler's first visit to Sobibor. Firstly, in the autumn of 1942, the Sobibor SS began to implement SS-Standartenführer Pohl Blobel's Action 1005, presumably as Himmler had observed the issue that Sobibor was having in the July of 1942, as its first mass grave had overflowed and created what SS-Oberscharführer Kurt Berlender referred to as an unworkable stench. Given that Blobel had commenced Action 1005 in the June of 1942, first experimenting at the Chelmno extermination camp, it is likely that Himmler had recommended to Stangl and the Sobibor SS to begin burning the bodies, instead of just burying them, in line with Blobel's Action 1005. Secondly, the camp itself was rapidly expanded, with new barracks and administration buildings being erected in the weeks and months following Himmler's first visit. Following a transport moratorium at the end of July 1942, Sobibor also faced 2 months of relative quiet until the October of 1943, when it started receiving non-local Jews once more. During this period, the old gas chambers were torn down, and bigger ones constructed in its place. It is highly likely that Himmler informed Stangl, following his first inspection of Sobibor, that the size of the camp and the carrying capacity of its gas chambers would be insufficient within the scope of Operation Reinhard, leading to Stangl's successor, SS-Hauptsturmführer Franz Karl Reichleitner, to heed Himmler's warning and consequently construct new gassing facilities. Roughly 7 months later, in early February 1943, Franz Karl Reichleitner, who was still Sobibor's commandant at the time, received word that Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler would once again visit Sobibor on February the 12th, 1943. Reichleitner, who was eager to impress Himmler, ensured that everything was prepared in ample time for the Reichsführer's visit. As part of his preparations, Reichleitner ordered that around 100 Jewish women were to be transferred from the Lublin region to Sobibor by truck, with the historian Marek Bem speculating that these girls might have arrived from the local Travniki concentration camp. Esther Raab, who survived the Sobibor revolt, recalled the arrival of the 100 girls as follows. The girls arrived, who were put up in Lager 1. During this time, I saw Gomerski, Wagner, and other SS going into the barracks, which was always followed by the girls screaming. I presume that they were being beaten in there. After Himmler arrived, the girls were taken into Lager 2, where they had to undress in front of him. Their hair was also cut short by the male workers from Lager 1. As Esther Raab alluded to in her testimony, Reichleitner had imported these women as sacrificial lambs for Himmler's imminent visit. No transports were due at Sobibor on February the 12th, 1943. So to be able to show the Reichsführer SS how the gassing operations worked at Sobibor, Reichleitner had to import victims from Lublin. Then, on February the 12th, 1943, the big day finally came. Heinrich Himmler arrived into Sobibor with SS Sturmbannführer Christian Wirth, overseer of the Action Reinhard death camps. Following Himmler's arrival into Sobibor, Reichleitner wasted no time at all, showing the Reichsführer SS the extermination process at the camp. Himmler was taken straight to Lager 2, where he observed the shearing and undressing of the roughly 100 Jewish girls from Lublin, before observing their sprint down the tube towards Lager 3, the extermination area. Once in Lager 3, Himmler observed the gassing and then the burning of the corpses, in line with Action 1005. SS-Oberscharführer Hubert Gomerski recalled Himmler's visit as follows. Quote, I remember the visit of the Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler to Sobibor well. All the SS men, members of the police, and the Ukrainian volunteers were lined up in a parade. I personally reported to my platoon, to Himmler, for inspection. I know that on the day when Himmler was in Sobibor, a certain number of Jews were gassed. I can tell for sure that Himmler visited Camp 3, or the extermination area, as I saw Himmler with a large group of officers heading in the direction of Camp 3. Unquote. SS-Oberscharführer Karl Frenzel recalled his role of patrolling the perimeter during Himmler's second visit to Sobibor. Quote, I was assigned to patrol the outside of the camp for some of the Travniki guards to ensure Himmler's personal safety. While Himmler was observing the gassing procedure in Lager 3, I secured the surrounding area in Lager 4. Unquote. After witnessing the observatory gassing, Reichleitner took Himmler to Sobibor's canteen, where a lavish spread had been prepared for him, with a table decorated with flowers. After enjoying some food and drink, Himmler gave a short speech to the Sobibor SS, in which he praised them for their efficiency and strength of character in the face of a difficult task. According to Jules Schelvis, Himmler told the Sobibor SS the following, quote, SS men, do not give up. The order has been given. If you are not strong, you must bear the consequences. Unquote. After his speech, Himmler then promoted Reichleitner, thanked the staff one last time, and departed. In the immediate aftermath of Himmler's second visit to Sobibor, the Reichsführer SS noted that the extermination camp was, quote, virtually idle, unquote, having accomplished its task of annihilating most of the Jews in its surrounding vicinity. Therefore, Himmler decided to select Sobibor to be a future destination for transports from both France and the Netherlands, with roughly 34,000 Jews being deported from the Westerbork transit camp to Sobibor in the months following Himmler's visit on February the 12th, 1943. Later that same year, Himmler also planned to try and convert Sobibor from an extermination camp into a concentration camp, or a KL. Given its proximity to Lublin, Himmler rationalized that Sobibor could rapidly expand, and then take in Jews for forced labor from both the Lublin region and potentially from Belarus. In a letter to Oswald Pohl on July 5, 1943, Himmler outlined this vision. Quote, "The Durchgangslager Sobibor in the Lublin district must be transformed into a concentration camp and contain a facility for making confiscated munitions reusable. At this camp, there is also to be established a workshop for producing grenades and other munitions." Unquote. Oswald Pohl, who saw the transformation of Sobibor into a KL as entirely unnecessary, likely given the proximity of Majdanek, conferred with Globoknik, who agreed with him. Therefore, roughly a week later, on July 15th, 1943, Pohl responded to Himmler, in which he wrote, quote, "Reichsführer, concerning your directive that Durchgangslager Sobibor in the Lublin district should be transformed into a concentration camp, I have discussed this with SS Gruppenführer Globoknik, and we propose that you not carry out this action, because the purpose you have in mind, to establish a workshop for processing appropriated munitions, can be achieved without this transformation of Sobibor into a KL." Unquote. Himmler approved of Pohl's response, and Sobibor commenced expansion, albeit on a smaller scale than Himmler had anticipated. Camps 1, 2, and 3 were left unchanged, with the expansion coming in the form of the new camp, Camp 4, or the Nordlager. In Camp 4, Himmler envisioned that Sobibor would have multiple small munitions workshops in which inmates would convert and repair captured Soviet small arms, to eventually be reconditioned and sent back to the ever-precarious Eastern Front. Alas for Himmler, the fruits of Lager 4 were never properly realized, as, on October the 14th, 1943, the Jews of Sobibor launched a successful revolt, leading to the premature closure of the Sobibor extermination camp. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this video on Himmler's visits to Sobibor to be both informative and interesting. If you missed part 1 of this mini-series, in which I covered Himmler's visits to Auschwitz, then please click here, or look for the link to the playlist in the video description. In part 3, I'll cover Himmler's visit to Treblinka, so make sure to like and subscribe so that you don't miss out on the notification. If you have any other questions, then please let me know in the comment section below. I'll be more than happy to answer them. Other than that, have a great day, and I'll see you next time.